Just so you believe that I'm not making anything.
Okay, welcome everyone to this workshop, discussion, diptych lecture on Marxism and psychoanalysis, alliance or conflict from Soviet psychology to the present. I'm Alberto Toscano, co-director of the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought. Before I introduce our speakers, just a couple of announcements just about events that'll be happening in the next couple of weeks. So on the 5th and 6th of June, as in next week, we have our conference on Baudelaire and philosophy. That's a two-day, all-day conference.
Which date?
The 5th and the 6th. So that's Wednesday and Thursday, I believe. With a host of international speakers, including Alyssa Marger, Jennifer Bajorek, Adrian Rifkin, and others. And on the 10th, there will be a talk by Kevin McLaughlin called Philology of Life on Dr. Benjamin's literary criticism. And then on the 21st, which I believe is the last day of term, a dialogue between David Lloyd and Lucy Mercier and David's most recent book, Underrepresentation, the Racial Regimes of Aesthetics, I think is the subtitle. So I'm very happy to have Keti Chukhrov and Samo Tomsic here with us to discuss this topic. This was as part of a project that I believe is maybe Keti can...
Well, it's part of the Marie Curie Fellowship Research Dissemination Work Package.
Okay, very important, work package. So it's not even a symposium, it's a work package. Okay.
So a big profit here
yeah.
for the management. But no, it's kidding, but so my framework is connected with the research, and I decided to invite Samo to collaborate with me because we had a long debate about how to treat alienation in capitalist and non-capitalist societies. Anyway, I'm really grateful that the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought and Alberto hosted us, and I'm really happy to be here.
So I'll give a quick introduction. Samo teaches at and researches at Humboldt University in Berlin. He is the author of The Capitalist and Conscious, Marx and Lacan, published by Version 2015, and of another volume that came out in 2019 called The Labor of Enjoyment Toward a Critique of Libidinal Economy. Keti teaches at the Department of Cultural Studies at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow, and has authored a number of texts on art theory and philosophy, including a book called To Be, to Perform, Theater in Philosophic Critique of Art. Now, as you'll have seen from the blurb, the remit of the afternoon is really to explore the relationship between Soviet psychology and Soviet critiques, or critiques of psychoanalysis taking place in the Soviet era, especially in the 1920s and 30s, but also after, in relation to the theoretical and philosophical interrogation of the relationship between Marxism and psychoanalysis in the 1970s, but also all the way into the present and into the kind of debates that Samo himself has made such a contribution to more recently. So the structure of this will be that Keti will speak for around 40 minutes, then Sam will speak for around 40 minutes, and then we'll just have a general discussion around the things that have emerged.
Okay.
So, without further ado.
Let's start.
Oh, by the way, do you want me to tell you, give you any time notice, or are you?
Okay, well, if you feel that I'm too much already somewhere, then give me a notice, yeah. Let's start. This decision to have a session is part of my research because I have recently finished a book which is not yet published, exactly on the issues of how certain emancipation theories work in socialist context, in the context of the political economy of planned and distributive economy, and how they would function in capitalist context, even when capitalist context inscribes in itself resisting theories. The issue of the libidinal, the issue of the surplus value, enjoyment, all this psychoanalytical lexicon is extremely important for the context, because the main thing that happens in the socialist political economy is that successfully or unsuccessfully surplus economy and libidinal economy is somehow castrated and sequestered. So my research was how to deal with the political economy of shortage and distribution, and what is the production of, what is the outcome and result of the economy of delibidinized production. And Samo deals with these issues as well, how it would function, whether it would produce the de-alienated areas, to what extent they would be criminalized or forceful. But anyway, I would like to start, because the first argument immediately which I receive at any discussion is that, come on, stop it. This is not non-libidinal economy. There was market, there was state capitalism, there was alienation. Of course, this is relatively right, but I want to remind you that. Well, I disagree with these statements, and I think that they start from Althusser's book on Sociality, and then they are supported by Bolivar's Dictatorship of Proletariat, where they claim that socialism was simply some kind of deviated form of capitalism. Well, this is to a certain extent acceptable, but what we see in the production, in the form of object, in the form of the commodity, in the body production, gender production, sexuality production, in the context of distributive economy, gives us completely different sociological results. And therefore, I will try to show you that we cannot rely on those books when we come to the experience of the Soviet socialism. And my first parable, a little bit to seduce you, would be a little example from theology. In Orthodox theology, as you know, hell doesn't have any location. So what in patristics the theologians are telling is that what is hell actually? Hell is the situation when you have not, when you didn't get rid of your desires, of your libidinal aspirations. You have this phantasmatic desire to exert enjoyment, to feel enjoyment, but all of a sudden you get into paradise. And you simply, in the paradise, don't have the body to exert this desire. So, what is hell? The hell is not that you are punished and shifted somewhere just because you, I don't know, violated certain rules, but it is the condition when desires sustain and the organs and material organics and body to implement this desire is absent. So this is to a certain extent the condition which we have to envisage when we imagine socialist condition, when the desire, the capitalist subject is still maybe existing, but the forceful and rigid economics, which is criminalizing the surplus, makes it impossible to exert those forms of enjoyment and desire. So how this mutated situation can function. Okay, I start with important tradition which we have in the philosophy of 60s, and one functional paradox in theories of emancipation since Althusser, which becomes extremely and especially evident in Judith Butler's theory of psychics and gender composition, itself very much influenced by Althusser's theory of subject and Foucault's theory of sexuality. So according to this paradoxic logic, the subject is subjugating itself by virtue of creating itself. And then this logic goes through all most important emancipatory theories of the 60s. Similar logic goes for desire and sexuality. Without the control of desire, one cannot acquire and forge that very desire. Without clinical surveillance of sexuality, as we have in Foucault, one cannot acquire the lexicons of sexual enjoyment. The same is Castoriadis. Phantasm is a negative force of the imaginary and the unconscious, but it is unsurmountable because it is at the same time creative potentiality. The same logic of this mutation of negativity and emancipation we have in Lacan and Zizek, because here the sublime categories are already cracked, and the very absolute itself is this rupture. I think that Samo's book in a way prolongs this brilliant tradition because he shows that enjoyment is negative, it is alienating, but it has to be productive too, and Samo shows very well how production functions within alienation and this obsession on obsessive thanatography of enjoyment. So in this logic, there is this Möbius double-bind context of the sociality. Sociality is negative. It is the side that subordinates the individual. Yet at the same time, this negative sociality is the playground to display the acts of emancipation. It is because of such ambivalence of social fields that, for example, Butler emphasizes the double-bind genealogy of the subject and searches for the remainder of social space free from subjugation and apparatuses. And this free remainder is the gendered body and the psychic dimension. But what is this psychic and gender dimension that has to be devoid of apparatuses and at the same time able for emancipation? It's clinical. So again, I refer to Samo, who says that clinical is political. And this is also a great negatively conceived problem, that the only political potential has to be clinical. It means that in the realm of psyche and individual body subversions, it means that it is only in the realm of psyche and individual body subversions one can resist the power discourse. But the question is how to extend such solipsist resistance in the frame of clinics into the commons. As theorized by Butler, the notion of psychics and gender bears the imprint of such clinical solitariness, and then gender's genealogy is the twofold process of subjugation and emancipatory yearning, but this yearning is generated as a result of initial loss of the other. So why sociality is negative? Because the other is lost. And it is due to narcissistic internalization of such loss that we have this double-bind logic of solipsism and internalization of the other, and the deadlock of the affirmative marking of the sociality. So sociality is emancipatory, but it is marked negatively. Although Butler tries to reconnect the melancholic individual with the other in the social stratum, such an attempt remains speculative and insufficiently active. So society is the realm of others, the realm that had not been invented by me, the realm where the other is either alien or is lacking as against my psychic life and gender composition, within which the imaginary other can be internalized or discarded. This is the reason why the big other, the ideal, the common, are regarded to be symbolic impositions which colonize the psyche, and then the subject tries to resist such colonization. Thus, we return to the idea of sociality as the double-bind category, the realm where one can enact the performance of freedom, but at the same time it remains the site of coercion and alienation by the token of it being external and alien to the individual. And then what remains here is the performative subversion. You have to transgress the power apparatus by means of a subversive performative behavior. So it is in this negative sense that psychics, gender, enjoyment, and alienation, and its libidinal parameters can be considered socially productive. But what happens that we find ourselves in use-value economics? And not to lose time, I will be just immediately making certain judgments, and then you can just dispute and just argue with me. So in the conditions of use-value economics and evicted private property, conversely, the point of departure is affirmative, constructivist sociality. What comes prior to me is the diachrony of society created by others. And it's not necessarily considered to be a negative ideological force of apparatuses to be subverted. On the contrary, sociality as something that is beyond me amplifies and constructs the subject. Why? Because all common good is already in the social structure. Common good is not in subject, but it is in the system. And system is more ethical, more productive. It is having advantages. It is more perfect than any citizenship that functions in it. So it is only via the social genesis that the subject's consciousness is posited, and the realm of sociality thus is not the site where inevitable loss of others is demonstrated, and where emancipation is posited negatively as the demonstration of such loss. So it is not the lack that, in Freudian sense, that is the problem of such a society, the lack of the other, the lack within the enjoyment procedure, the insaturable libidinal drive, but the problem of such society is the excess, the tragedy of excess of the acquired. So imagine, I gave you this paradise parable. You already have everything. Whatever you have is already there. Even its extreme poverty, it's pleroma. Then the problem is not the lack of communism, and my allegation is that even the deterioration of such socialism is not due to the lack of communism, but exactly due to excessive, too much communist elements in socialism. So this goes completely counter to what happened in the interpretation of socialism in 60s, 70s, in Althusserian and post-Althusserian thought. Then, what is the resisting element to be communist or to be socialist? What is the political agency then? You are not transgressing this apparatus, but you are stretching to it. So it's completely different, even anthropological move. So not transgressing or subverting, but trying to fit it. So you either fit this paradise, or you are dissident, or you have those desires that make this paradise hell for you. Well, you of course know one of the most seminal works of Lyotard, Libidinal Economy, and of course his work goes into the same pleiad or chain which I already enumerated, But Lyotard's book is so important because he's not only depicting this form of detesting libidinal economy, but at the same time being seduced by it and temptation, and he gives almost literary, fictional understanding of the despair of how capitalist subject suffers in these conditions. So on the one hand, we are invested into capitalist production, and our libidinal pulsions happen to be in tune with this economy, so we are unconsciously invested in it, and this is manifested in various forms of our behavior. Exchange, production, but when we start to criticize this condition, the problem is that the critique cannot free us from those capitalist pulsions. So the problem is that even when we are the critics of capitalism, the libidinality of capitalism does not free us from being capitalist subjects. And therefore, a very important construction in this logic is that to deprive the economy of its libidinal resource is always even more terrible than suffering from this libidinal resource. And Lyotard is showing this, that on the one hand, this is part and parcel of this capitalist surplus economy, but if we deprive ourselves from desire and libidinality, which construct capitalism, this would imply termination and castration of desire altogether, and getting rid of the vicious part of libidinality would also terminate the potential for creative fervor. That's why it's important that libidinality and libidinal economy sustains, because it is the part and parcel of constructing surplus economy, but at the same time it can deteriorate and forcefully eliminate the creative potential of the libidinal and of alienation, of course. So then my goal is to again come and describe this fantastic condition where surplus is criminalized and where libidinality is not forbidden, of course, because we know that the socialist societies were not based on desire economy or attractivity of consumption. Yet my goal is to show how all the terms and notions such as consciousness, sexuality, surplus, language, pleasure, they are turned head over heels in the conditions of post-libidinal political economy, and check whether it happens by means of imposition from party nomenclatura or government, because the main idea is that the socialist world lives like all other middle class, petty bourgeois society, but there are some crazy bureaucrats who are just imposing certain restrictions to this and this and this layer of life. I think this is also erroneous, because you can see, if you look at it, if you look on consumption forms and what happens by the end of 60s, 70s in the stagnation period of Brezhnev, how this outcomes of the sequestered counter-libidinal economy, they tell on bodies, tell on cultural production, tell on textures, and produce some kind of new type of not only ontology, but, as I allege, new type of ontics. And I will start from consciousness and go through like consciousness, sexuality, and language probably. What was the main rebuke to the unconscious and how to reaffirm consciousness in the situation when there was such a huge tradition of psychoanalysis is that, the problem with psychoanalysis and with the unconscious that starts from Voloshinov in his book Freudianism and then goes through Vygotsky's critique and then goes through Soviet psychology of Leontief was that definitely the unconscious is a necessary part of consciousness, but there is no epistemic division between the unconscious and consciousness. These are not two material forces, but these are two contents, actually, two ideologies. So what is the problem with the unconscious? It is stuck in Freudian psychoanalysis to psyche. And psyche is much more than know, connected with the solipsist self-analysis, self-observation. So it doesn't have enough and sufficient tools to produce the common work. And what is important in consciousness? So consciousness is re-established in this socialist framework, not at all as a psychological category. So consciousness is totally devoid of any psychological connection, with any phenomenological connections. And the main thing in consciousness, as Voloshinov puts it, is that it gives the opportunity to look at yourself from the point of view of the other. So how Lacan treats the other, for instance, how Judith Butler treats the other. The other is this absent other, or the other is the alienated I. So always the other is somehow mirroring the superego or the subject. And so even when in Lacan's case everything is internalized and ingressed into the unconscious, then of course there is the sociality, there is a huge material in this expanded Lacanian unconscious to provide social analysis, but nevertheless this analysis is stuck to the I. So this separate other is not able to become the full-fledged sovereign subject. And consciousness, as it is taken in Marxist terms, and we have it in Voloshinov, is this absolute standpoint of the other. I don't exist. So there is no ego. There is only the standpoint of the other, and then consciousness becomes the initial view of the other one. Because when the subject is born to the world, there is no ego. There are only other things. Everything is other. The culture is already produced. The language is produced. Material culture is produced. So what is consciousness? It's actually the reflection and some kind of remnants of what had been produced by others. So it's also actually the repository of the non-self being. So what is consciousness? It's a much more Hegelian term than phenomenological term. Consciousness is some kind of proof that most important thing in production is the other determined non-self being. So consciousness proves that the being is grounded in the non-self being, and this non-self element constructs consciousness. There is another very important description of how Marxist interpretation of consciousness works in the piece by Merab Mamardashvili. If you heard such philosopher, he worked in 60s, 70s, and he was disciple of Ilyenko. And he has two seminal works, Analysis of Consciousness in Works by Marx, and another Converted Forms in Marx. And he writes when he tries to account for how Marx treats consciousness. So again, this is not a psychic realm and domain, but polit-economic domain. Marx constructed his research so that already in the point of departure, he had to deal with the systems functioning and realized via consciousness. These were for him the social and economic systems. Hence, it became possible to consider consciousness as the function, as the attribute of social system, deducing the contents of consciousness and form from the intersections and differentiations in the system, and not from the simple reflection of the object in the subject's perception. So it has nothing to do with perception, it's the construction of production. Thus, consciousness itself functions as the objectified realia to which the individual is extended. And as Mamardashvili writes, for Marx, it is not projection that is the product of consciousness, but consciousness is the reverse appropriation of that projection and objectification. And what is important here, it is realized completely independent of the individual and working in the social system. This impossibility to say I is constructing this kind of consciousness. Thus, for Voloshinov in his Freudianism too, it was important to claim this new ideology of consciousness and to find the real which could exert the social function, not on behalf of the I, but taking the already existing and created material culture, not as the repository of the other unconscious, but as the produced common good, common value, in certain sense. And now I shift to most tricky part, which is sexuality and libidinality. What is important here? Definitely when we talk about the castrated sexuality of the socialist life, everyone is asking, well, are you crazy? Well, it had even more sex than other capitalist societies. It's definitely, it might be so. I'm not a sociologist to really analyze that. But again, I totally agree with Samo because he has a wonderful observation in his book about the drive. You're right, the drive has nothing to do with this natural initial realm, but it is produced as some kind of quasi-physiological, artificial product, and it has this symbolic undercurrents nonetheless than other symbolic things. So this element which is considered to be in the very basis of libidinal production is in fact also symbolically grounded, which means that if you don't have certain ontic conditions for the production of the drive, then it can be not necessarily eliminated, but it can start function in other way. So then my analysis of sexuality is not starting from bodies, but it starts from how phantasm is conditioned. And of course, sexuality is not sex and simply genital intercourse, but it is language. It is a speculative value and speculative phenomenon. And the confirmation for this is in the Foucauldian work, where Foucault shows that sexuality appears only with the bourgeois consciousness when it is juridically either prohibited or just taken as some kind of surplus enjoyment. It is not part of feudal context. Then what happens to the object which is not libidinal, which is not a commodity object? And then you will understand why this object and the form of this object is so important to talk about sexuality, is that it is constructed and produced in the frame of basic need. So in capitalist production, the surplus and the economic surplus is intertwined with the libidinal and phantasmatic surplus. So what comes first is not clear. Well, Marx believes that this phantasmatic surplus and fascination of the fetish can be unwinded, but then in later works we understand that this libidinal charm cannot be so easily unwinded. Nevertheless, if you have the basic need economy, then you have a fantastic basic need form of the object. When the object is not revealing its attractive parameters, but it is revealing its nominal parameters, as if the Platonic myth could have been realized in terms of like the chair is the chairness of chair, the table is the tableness of table, the pen is the penness of pen, but not a specific pen, or not a pen of special company which is producing these pens and not other pens. And if you go through the material culture, and if you have this basic need objecthood, then you understand that what happens in this object is that this division between the utilitarian functional element and the phantasmatic element is completely minimized. And then the object becomes a nomen, simply a nomen. And this nominalization of the meta, when the object practically fits its own name and word and concept and meaning, is very well described already in art, for instance, in Moscow conceptualism, which we are using exactly these bad socialist objects, absolutely unneeded, unattractive, and non-fascinating, and calling them the bad thing, the bad object, плохая вещь. And this bad object, in certain sense, was a sublime object, because it was a nominal object. So this is one of the outcomes of how it functions in the material culture. But then you have the extension into the biopolitics of sexuality, and what happens with this biopolitics of sexuality. For instance, imagine that this basic need object is the underwear. And how to exist sexually within this basic need underwear. And there were many exhibitions in post-Soviet context about this issue, how to construct body in these conditions. But I would refer you to Andrei Platonov's pamphlet, which is called Anti-Sexus. It's a famous pamphlet where Andrei Platonov is making an irony about how to devoid sexuality from libidinal parameters and turn it only to satisfaction of the urge. So that the sexuality is simply genital innervation. And then you can prove that sexuality is not about genitality, but it's about this libidinal surplus. So then, even if you don't have genital context, you can have libidinal surplus, and things can be sexual. And at the same time, you can have genital context, and this genital context can be devoid of the libidinality and sexuality. And so Anti-Sexus device is the device that aims to remove from life and communication not sex but sexuality, libidinality, desire, drive. And what is obliterated in it is precisely the yearning, the libidinal, the surplus element, the elusive something. Genital satisfaction, as against sexuality, does not necessarily reside in desire. It is implemented in an immediate biophysiological need. So what is this dystopia of Platonov is that in every factory or in every institution there will be, this apparati for the urge discharge, and this would free Soviet citizens from this libidinal element, and they would be great friends, great lovers. Also, the production would increase etc. So,
Don't tell management.
yes, of course. So this is obsession, like to tear away sexuality in this biophysical determination. But this biophysical determination is the obsession of Voloshinov as well, and of Vygotsky as well. When Vygotsky is writing the introduction to Beyond Pleasure Principle, initially he's quite critical of Freud because of his pleasure principle, because pleasure principle is foreclosing the reality principle. But in this case, he interprets the Beyond Pleasure Principle as the impact of pure biology, which is able to evade psyche. Well, you prove that it's not that. It's not so at all, and I agree with you, because the enjoyment principle and Thanatos, death drive principle, are interconnected, and these are not two separate things. But this is the interpretation of Vygotsky, because they want to extract this biophysical element, material element, from sexuality. And the same thing happens in Voloshinov's work, who is criticizing Freud exactly for this obsessive, not obsessive, exactly from detachment of the psychical from the somatic. As he writes, in Freud's work on sexuality, both its social and physiological parameters are superseded by psyche and are thus deprived of physical, somatic, and hence materialist parameters, which would enable them to be more directly dependent on social economic factors. So why biological parameters are advantageous and primary? Because psyche is a stumbling block between sociality and access to the individual. And then the reduction of sexuality to a biological dimension would enable it to be redirected to the sphere of genital, which is actually antisexual, and without libidinal undercurrents, the bond with the sociality would be smoother. I think my last point would be then what happens in these conditions to the language. Because the linguistic part is also very important to Samo. But generally, well, I will try to put it very simply. Generally, language is an abstraction, right? So it's the mode of alienation, abstraction, of signification, and some kind of detachment of the signifier from the possibility to relate to reality. And it's a traumatic point, how to relate the signifier to the reality. So there are two modes of how to treat this autonomy and alienated mode of the signifier. One is Lacanian mode, and he's saying that, well, the subject is not able to surpass this permanent alienated condition of discourse, and it's not impossible to surpass the alienated parameters of the signifier. The second alternative is Deleuzian-Guattarian, which says that yes, there is alienation in the signifier, but let's make this performative complement. Let's make schizophrenic performative play and somehow try to go beyond the signifier and then get some kind of asignifying possibilities. And then alienation is treated so that you alienate alienation. So you, to somehow exceed the already existing regulated alienation of capitalism, you are complementing it and adding to this capitalist alienation certain performative, even more uncanny and more intense forms of alienation to produce the creative and artistic subversion of it. I'm moving very fast, sorry for that, but I'm finishing in a couple of minutes. So what happens in the Vygotskian linguistics, with Voloshinov, with Ilyenkov, so all that group that was working with how to re-establish and reinstitute language in the socialist conditions, also because it was the repository of either conscious or unconscious phenomena. So what happens here is that, yes, language deals with abstraction, language is generalization, it is abstraction, but what stands behind the language is not instincts, affects, drives, or the unconscious, that what stands behind the language is not some kind of non-cultural, psychic, contingent categories, but this is totally crazy. What stands behind the language is even more ideal, more general picture, and this is the picture of exactly this non-self being and non-self reality of labor. And labor is, of course, ideal, as we know, because it's the activity of it's part of the human activity. So. Beyond language is not the unconscious, it is sociality and collective labor, which is general simply because it is by definition ungraspable by individual mind, and it's diachronic in its historicist scale. And then language becomes simply application. So language is not something that you have to fear, but language has a very applied role, and as Alexei Leontiev writes in his Activity and Consciousness, language is the vehicle of meaning, but language is not the demiurge of meaning. Concealed behind linguistic meanings are socially evolved modes of action, in the process of which people change and cognize objective reality. So the problem is not then the split between signifier and signified, the split between word and thing, but that objecthood itself is nomen. So again, what I told you when I talked about commodity, that this capacity to for the object to exist in general terms is before the language. Then this becomes the motto for Vygotsky as well, because Vygotsky is saying that the word is ready only when the notion is ready. This is also quite crazy. So the notion precedes the word. And this is counter-Jacobsonian statement, because Roman Jacobson's philosophy of language was residing on the possibility of the contingent throw of autopoiesis of language. And he writes how the child is producing this autopoietic capacity to produce language. And then if language is totally attached initially and by definition to the notion, and the notion is in addition to this already objecthood, then this becomes complete paradise. So, and then return to this crazy book by Voloshinov, which is Marxism and the Philosophy of Language, which is also saying the same thing. Word is not internal. That's why, this is the reason why he's not trusting psychoanalysis, because psychoanalysis is all the time internalizing speech, right? Psychicizing speech. And he claims word is external, not internal, because there is nothing unexpressed in the world, in the word. Ideology is social, psyche individual, and hence psyche follows ideological sign, not the other way. Therefore, inner speech cannot solve the issue of the collective, of the social, of political, simply because it does not depart from the other. Again, this initial condition of the other. And I'm ending with this question, which is very unresearched question about this nominality of the material, which is my idea, but it really needs more and more evidences. So where it comes from, as you remember, I mentioned cleaning, and probably Samo will be talking about cleaning. But for instance, Leontiev, when he was writing his book Activity and Consciousness, and claiming that before the language comes the notion, and the ideal element of material life is already present, they were relying on their experiments with the deaf and blind children. And here you have totally deviated creatures. They have no capacity to hear, no capacity to see, moreover, no capacity to speak. So then in this case, the project is not clinic but pedagogy. And then what was the tool to organize that these children learn language and acquire consciousness? What they acquire, consciousness or the unconscious, how they acquire it. So they were organizing the technique of how to create language in a situation when there is no eyesight, no perception, no capacity to see first the image of the object, but the learning was completely manual. So, already on the level of Gegenstand, touching the object, the optical, conceptual, cognitive categories were formed. And that's why all of them were claiming that the material is already the speculative, cognitive, and connected with the thing. So before this deaf and blind child produces the word, he or she already produces the cognitive comprehending parameters of having this notion out of this very straightforward haptic materiality that he has through manual touch. And then, well, Leontief has lots of theories about dioptrics, and he refers to Diderot. I have no time for this. But this was very important to claim and somehow to assert that a Marxist idea was the same, that already on the level of the materiality, already on the level of labor, already on the level when this deaf and blind child is learning how to use the spoon or how to touch the form of an art piece or sculpture and understand this sculpture, because it's not simply about the touch and the body, but it is about, by means of the hand, constructing the nomen, the meaning. So already on this level you can get Bildung. I would end up here and then we could discuss.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Keti, for inviting me in this exchange, and to Alberto for hosting the event in the framework of the center. I will stick to an unwritten arrangement that Keti already also gave away. So I will talk about the question of alienation, and basically about something that is one of my little private obsessions that get professional expression, an attempt to sort of de-dramatize the notion of alienation and try to kind of point or provide also an optimistic reading of it, even though I'm aware that the optimistic and the pessimistic, or the dramatic and the comic aspect of alienation are interrelated. So basically, I will talk about Descartes for most of the time in the second half of my talk, in order to point out very basic thing, how Marx and Freud are actually repeating Descartes in reverse, so to speak. So basically there will be very commonly known, I assume, Lacanian points floating around, but I thought that I would just recall them for framing the debate on alienation, and also to kind of make us all remember why alienation is so crucial for psychoanalysis, for critique of political economy, for materialist orientation of thinking. I will do a return to Descartes in order to reflect on Lacan's point that Descartes' deduction of cogito is the condition of the Freudian subject of the unconscious. And if the proletarian and the subject of the unconscious are closely related, as Lacan sometimes openly argued and sometimes implicitly indicated, then Marx and Freud are ultimately engaged with the repressed truth of cogito and, as I said, repeat Descartes in verse. Descartes is thus here as an epistemological condition of the Freudian Marxian materialist theory of the subject. I will go through what is fundamental to psychoanalysis and particularly for Lacan, the attempt to elaborate a materialist theory of language. Let us leave open whether this theory is scientific, philosophical, or something third. In any case, it is a strict doctrine in Lacan's teaching. A materialist theory of language which comes in pair or is simply indistinguishable from a materialist theory of the subject. Lacan provided formalized writing for this nexus, the barred A and the barred S, which respectively designate the incompleteness of the field of language and the incompleteness of the subject. And here I can already react in a way to what Keti was also addressing. Talking about incompleteness is of course misleading here because it leads one to believe that something is lacking and that filling this lack will make the subject or language complete. This is neither Freud's nor Lacan's point. Lack is not correlated to a positively existing object which would fill in the lack, but to a surplus which cannot be mapped onto the lack and vice versa. Freud called this castration. We know that the same issue is at stake in Marx when he talks about the drive of enrichment or the drive of self-valorization. Surplus value does not fill in the gap that defines the drive and guarantee its satisfaction. On the contrary, it stimulates the drive and is the cause of its perpetual dissatisfaction. So if you read it's no coincidence that in all crucial passages of Capital, Marx speaks of trip, same word as in Freud. I would argue it's the same concept, but you don't have to take my word. But to return to the question of incompleteness, here also the notorious question of alienation finds its proper place, insofar as alienation stands for a process which marks the subject as well as the other. Lacan's dictum, the other does not exist, can be associated precisely with the question of the alienation of the other, the big other. Language, symbolic order. This placement of the problem, however, should be supplemented with a historical framing, a history of alienation, or perhaps better, a history of philosophical confrontations of alienation, which is indeed the history of modern philosophy, reaching back to good old Descartes. And in this history, Marx evidently assumes a central place. In his thesis on Feuerbach, one can read how Marx addresses the question of decentralization of the subject, which is one of the synonyms for alienation. What are the features of a materialist conception of man, or rather of the subject? First, his formulation of what he calls, quote, the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism. And this defect lies, according to Marx, in the fact that, quote, the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity practice, not subjectively, unquote. You know, these famous lines. In other words, materialism before Marx makes the mistake of excluding the subject from the picture, thus leaving the terrain for thinking human activity to idealism, whose defect in turn consists in the fact that, as Marx writes, it, quote, does not know real sensuous activity as such, unquote. So materialism before Marx knows sensuous activity but without a subject, reformulated. An example of this would be mechanicism or Lamettrie's man-machine, whereas idealism knows the subject but without sensuous activity. Here, activity pertains to an immaterial substance which is not lost, precisely not alienated, in the body. So again, non-sensuous activity. And one could add at this point that Hegel does not fit this picture, since his whole attempt is to think substance as subject, hence as becoming, another keyword for alienated being. Feuerbach, from whom Marx is delimiting himself, thus resolves the idealist or religious essence, the activity of abstractions, into human essence, thus creating the appearance that he points the way toward real sensuous activity and to the real subjectivity. But this is not the case for, quote Marx, the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual, unquote. Behind the appearance of materialism, the move of reducing divine essence to human essence, Marx overlooks that this essence is, quote, Marx again, in its reality the ensemble of social relations, unquote. Man is relational being. His essence is outside, his relation is alienation, and because Feuerbach does not see this, he ends up in idealism, where the question is to reverse alienation. If man is alienated in God, then the inverse operation will bring man back to himself. For Feuerbach, alienation is thus a symmetrical, reflexive operation. And this is precisely not the case for Marx. For him, relations between men, social relations, are traversed by non-relationality, inauthenticity, distortion, which cannot be brought back to some presumable authenticity. And he names this in different ways. Mystification, class struggle, fetishism, ideology, and so on and so forth. In a way, Freud reproduces the Feuerbachian move. In a way. One merely needs to consult his developments in this text on religion, the future of an illusion, and in the concluding lecture on Weltanschauung, on worldviews, from his new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. There, Freud famously compares God with the figure of the Father, providing an anthropological materialist interpretation of religious abstractions. So, we are helpless. We want a strong father. Oops, we don't get it because every father is a failure. Oh, let's project things to God, the ideal father. So behind God is the idea of the ideal father, an abstraction which, however, has consequences in difference to the Feuerbachian idealities. Whenever Freud uses the word illusion, we should not take it easily. So, in a way, he reproduces the Feuerbachian movement with this projection, but the illusion is real in Freud. Marx's break with Feuerbach, a break that I described as epistemological, has in its core a theory of the subject understood as an effect of the ensemble of social relations, thus not a ground, hypokainon, which would precede the ensemble in question. All this is well known, but it should be remembered that if Marx here indeed plays out one materialism against the other, then the problematic of alienation necessarily plays a key role in the determination of true materialism against the false one. In Feuerbach, human essence precedes alienation and is externalized, the topological meaning of alienation. In the second step, Here, alienation is secondary, something that is constituted. But what constitutes alienation is the question. It is usually said that the young Marxists subscribe to this view and that the thesis on Feuerbach aimed to set things straight. There is no human essence preceding alienation, but alienation is primary, constitutive for the subject. The subject understood as an effect of the ensemble of social relations is a relational being outside itself. Again, externalization, Veräußerung, which is a key Hegelian term for alienation and Fremdung. In passing, I can add that this operation of externalization is also crucial for what Marx in Capital calls Verwandlung, metamorphosis, for instance, of money into commodities, of surplus value into capital, of labor force into surplus labor, etc. In any case, externalization is crucial for thinking the subject according to Marx, and for elaborating a materialist theory of the subject. This externalization is also characteristic for the Freudian notion of the unconscious, which comes in as a surprising complement of Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. But it was only Lacan that linked this with the question of materialist theory of language. For instance, most explicitly in his responses to the École Normale Supérieure philosophy students, where we read the following a bit longer passage, so sorry for this long quote now. Only my theory of language as a structure of the unconscious can be said to be implied by Marxism, if, that is, you are not more demanding than the material implication with which our most recent logic is satisfied. That is, that my theory of language is true, whatever be the adequacy of Marxism, and that it is needed by it, whatever be the defect that it leaves Marxism with. So much for the theory of language implied logically by Marxism. As for the one it has implied historically, I have barely but to offer you, given the modest limits of my information as to what goes on beyond a certain doctrinal curtain, 30 pages by Stalin that put an end to the frolics of Marism, from the name of the philologist Mar, who considered language to be a superstructure. Statements of rudimentary common sense concerning language, and specifically concerning the point that it is not a superstructure, whereby the Marxist, on the subject of language, situates himself far above the logical positivist. The least you can accord me concerning my theory of language is, should it interest you, that it is materialist. The signifier is matter transcending itself in language. So unquote. So the connection between Marxism and psychoanalysis, or between Marx and Freud, is less historical than it is logical. Lacan speaks of material implication, thus pointing out the logical rootedness of materialism, which, to recall, is always true, except in the case when the antecedent is true and the consequence is false. No false theory can follow from a true theory, so if Marx's theory is considered true, then Freud's theory is necessarily true. The inverse, and this might be provoking for Marxists, does not hold. If Marx is false, Freud can still be true. This logical implication, this logical materialist alliance, nevertheless did not prevent a history of misunderstandings and mutual suspicion. Joan Kopchak commented the excerpt from Lacan in the following manner, and I apologize again for a long quote. But she really puts it in the best possible manner. As Lacan reminds us in his responses to students in philosophy, the materialist position was fixed in 1928 by Nicholas Yakovlevich Mar, who concluded that language was a part of the superstructure. That is, it was a direct reflection of class struggle, of the social determinations of the base. Rather than a national language, then, there were thought to be class languages, just as in Lysenko account there were thought to be class sciences. 22 years later, this solution was amended by Stalin to point of matter of factly for counterproof to the continuity of the Russian language despite the social changes brought about by the revolution. Having removed language from the superstructure, Stalin was prohibited, nevertheless, from assigning it to the base, since he believed that language was in itself incapable of producing anything, not Lacan's point. Defining as neither superstructure nor base the only available alternatives in this schema, language was emptied of all attributes and became, in theory, a purely transparent instrument of communication. A return to Aristotle. Against these problematic stances, Lacan argues, and he is not alone in this, that language has its own level of determinacy, that it is itself productive of effects, unquote. So this ambiguous placement of language in an intermediate zone, neither base nor superstructure, but something that is pre-basic and pre-superstructural, neither sensuous nor suprasensuous, is crucial for situating the encounter of Marx and Freud. Language is placed here in an ontological gray zone, the same gray zone in which Marx situated the system of exchange, or the symbolic order that sustains economic relations. Because it is localized in this gray zone, language can be marked by a timeless problematic, precisely alienation, which is nevertheless subject to change. So it's at the same time historical. Why? If language would be a phenomenon of base, it would be unchangeable. If it would be part of the superstructure, changing it would not cause any major issue. And this was also Stalin's dilemma. To put it in Lacanese, in Soviet Russia, in communism, language was still following the logic of the master's discourse, which is in itself already a problem. But the status of language is paradoxical. It's an ontological scandal. It does not exist, strictly speaking. Again, Lacan's haiku. The other does not exist. Yet it has material consequences. First and foremost, the body it inhabits, the speaking body. In his writing on drives and their vicissitudes, Freud addresses a similar problem, the ontological status of the drive, which he frames in the following manner, quote, if now we apply ourselves to considering mental life from a biological point of view, a drive appears to us as a concept of the frontier between the mental and the somatic, as the psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, as a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work in consequence of its connection with the body, unquote. So what is the drive? It is a positive force independent from its psychic, is it a positive force independent from its psychic representative, or is it rather the force of this representative itself? This is where one materialism, the biological one, is pitted against the other, the structural one. In his writing on the unconscious, Freud states, quote, the drive can never become an object of consciousness, only the idea that represents the drive can. Even in the unconscious, moreover, a drive cannot be represented otherwise than by an idea. When we nevertheless speak of an unconscious drive impulse or of a repressed drive impulse, we can only mean a drive impulse, the ideational representative of which is unconscious, unquote. So no biology in the unconscious, or if there is a biology, it's soaked with culture. Of course, a drive cannot become the object of consciousness because the drive does not exist. What exists is the drive force, the dynamic caused by the ideational representative, or as Lacan would put it, by the signifier, by language in the living body. This problematic juncture of the mental and the somatic stands at the very core of Freud's inquiries. The drive and the unconscious are merely two privileged names for the material consequences of the mental, the linguistic, in the body. What is at stake here is, as Jean-Claude Ménard fittingly put it, a parasitism of the infinite on the finite. The drive is described by Freud as constant force, hence as a force acting without interruption. In Marxist analysis of the double character of commodity, the same problematic juncture of the bodily and of the symbolic stands at the center. In the economic sphere, the fusion of use value and exchange value points towards the same drive parasitism of the infinite on the finite. Concretely, the infinite demand of surplus value on the finite laboring body. That's why labor is in the center of Marx's interests, because they're what's very fittingly named Verausgabung in German can be demonstrated. Verausgabung in the sense of economic expenditure and physiological exhaustion. So the body is sucked dry of surplus. Capital as drive of self-valorization too imposes its demand for work on the body, a demand for surplus labor, for which Marx reminds us or shows us that it is virtually endless and encounters its sole limit in the natural limit of the working day or in the physiological limits of the body folding itself together. Now, a materialist theory of language, to jump back to Lacan's interest, which goes hand in hand with the materialist theory of the subject, does not merely imply what Lacan calls matter transcending itself in language, but also language producing real consequences in the living body, or to inverse Lacan's formula, abstraction descending or getting inscribed in the body. Here, going against the Aristotelianism of Stalin's intervention in the Soviet linguistic debates, the Aristotelianism consists in the thesis according to which language is a means of communication, and that there is something like self-regulation and equilibrium in language. Lacan counteracts this view, which is anything but materialist. His double thesis on the autonomy and the causality of the signifier brings this protest against Stalinist Aristotelianism to the point. That's why also he says historically you can see that the material implication is illustrated by if Marxism is false, psychoanalysis is true. Stalin is false, Lacan is true. Language is an organized disequilibrium in the living body. So the self-transcendence of matter must be necessarily complemented with the immanence of abstraction to the body and with all the dysfunctions that it produces. In his Marxist philosophy of language, Jean-Jacques Le Cercle pointed out, on the case of Noam Chomsky, which pleases me immensely, that there is an affinity between modern linguistics and liberalism. One might say that just as for economic liberalism, the market is a self-regulating entity which exists and functions independently from human agencies, and homo economicus, a subject supposed to know how to act in accordance with the free market while possessing positive knowledge of its mechanisms, for linguistic liberalism, and one could also put the entire analytic philosophy in this basket, self-regulating language comes in pair with an idealized conscious subject of communication. In other words, for both language and the subject exist, for both economic and linguistic liberalism, language and the subject exist in a strong, substantial sense. What Le Cercle describes as a Marxist and materialist philosophy of language in turn follows the following perspectives, and I'll just line them up. Language is a form of praxis, a historical phenomenon, a social phenomenon, a material phenomenon, a political phenomenon, a place, one should rather say space of subjectivation through interpellation. This is where Lacanian would say interpellation is not going far enough. Suture would be Lacan's proposal. But all these features presuppose that language is alienation. Alienation in the primary sense that Hegel gives to the word Veräußerung, externalization, a process which is constitutive of the difference between the inner and the outer. It is at this point that one should, I think, refer to the history of alienation and to see how basically in the history of modern philosophy the problematic progressively came to the foreground. And before I continue babbling on that, how much time do I still have? Oh, okay. But I can say some parts of this. So the discovery of alienation, the first crucial philosophical encounter of alienation is constitutive for the thinking subject and as a fundamental concept of a materialist theory of the subject, coincides historically and logically with Descartes' introduction of the modern notion of the subject in the first place. That was Lacan's also implicit thesis that I'm trying to explicate here. Descartes founded philosophy on the modern scientific revolution and as an outcome resolving the wide-reaching crisis this revolution triggered in the systems of thought, in the pre-modern metaphysics. It was only a matter of time before these consequences would shake the Aristotelian foundations of the theory of the subject, his metaphysical psychology anchored in the hypothesis of the soul. Even if Descartes did not entirely abolish the vocabulary that was passed on by the Aristotelian tradition, the introduction of cogito marked an irreversible point that opened up the horizon in which the subsequent conceptualization of alienation was made possible. Descartes' philosophical gesture is subjective alienation in action, its most genuine exemplification. We merely need to consider his transformation of Montaigne's skepticism into a positive method of systematic doubt in order to notice that we are dealing with a specific mobilization of alienation in the field of modern science, or more generally, in the modern mode of knowledge production. Lacan most openly embraced the thesis that alienation became a philosophical question only with Descartes, that philosophical and scientific modernity and capitalist is inaugurated in and through subjective alienation, in distinction from pre-modern science, which was, according to Plato and Aristotle, driven by tautomazing, wonder, astonishment. Lacan repeatedly showed how the invention of cogito, Descartes' reduction of all human existence and its qualities to the pure I think, historically, philosophically, and epistemologically conditions the Freudian discovery of the unconscious and makes the subject of the unconscious another version of thought without qualities, just like the Cartesian cogito, notably without the quality of consciousness, thinkable in the first place. And this is, of course, from Lacan's part, a very strange, one could even say alienating thesis, since nothing could be more foreign to the Freudian subject than the Cartesian cogito. This subject reduced to the pure identity of thought with itself, I think, and to the apparent identity or coinciding of thinking with being. I think, therefore I am. The catch and the crack, for that matter, the crack on the surface of consciousness that inaugurates the royal road to alienation and negativity surely resides in the worm of doubt, which splits the subject and directs the movement of its thoughts. But it also resides in the structure of the most famous inference in the history of philosophy next to Aristotle's syllogism on the immortality of all men. The problematic therefore, ergo, which deduces being from thinking and which can be read as a joint that seems to establish continuity and at the same time indicates a minimal rupture or displacement between thinking and being, as well as within thinking and being. So if for Parmenides thinking and being was the same, In Descartes, they follow with a minimal displacement. Therefore, the Cartesian, therefore the ergo, is a double index, a link and a break, a continuity and a discontinuity. It binds only in order to expose a permanently resolute difference, a fissure in the subject's thinking and being. Due to this ambiguity of the cogito, Cartesianism could eventually ground both the idealist theories of the subject, consciousness, individualism, identity, and the materialist theories of the subject, unconscious, divisionalism, indifference to individualism, and non-identity, so modern idealism and materialism. Unknowingly, Descartes therefore contained the first recognition of the spatio-temporal displacement that marks the subject. But his deduction of cogito and the reduction of thought to consciousness amount to a centralized geometry of the subject, which erroneously postulates the primacy of relata before relation, the primacy of thinking and being before their problematic relation of identity and displacement, continuity and discontinuity, homotopy and heterotopy. In addition, privileging identity over non-identity removes the temporal dynamic from the process that constitutes the subject. History. There is no history on the level of the Cartesian subject. The best geometric representation of such a presumably non-alienated subject remains the Cartesian coordinate system, in which the space of res extensa emanates from the central point without extension. In contrast to this Cartesian geometrization of the space of thinking, the affirmation of alienation as constitutive for the subject implies a topological model that Lacan somewhat enigmatically called the asphere of non-all. So one of his typical play on words. But what's crucial here is the asphere, the non-sphere, the negation of the sphere, the negation of this idealized, closed, centralized shape. So the space of thinking and hence the structure of the subject are not closed and centralized, which would be the case if one were to take the sphere as a geometrical model. They are also not simply infinite. They are negation of finitude, so asphere or non-sphere again, which exposes their constitutive incompleteness, non-all character. So in this way, not only spatial disclosure, but also the historical process is introduced as a key component of the structure in question. So from a Lacanian perspective, the Cartesian cogito does not designate a being, but a process of becoming. The subject here no longer appears as an invariable and stable extra-historic or transhistoric center, but rather an unstable metonymic negativity which undergoes historical transformations and is thus permanently embedded in an open and conflictual process of becoming. This is why clinics in Freud, if Freud is a Cartesian, as Lacan argues, is precisely the illustration of this. The subject on the couch is his or her own conflictual history. And this is where thinkers like Hegel, Marx, and Freud progressively correct Cartesianism with their dialectical and materialist turn. I'm not going to spell it out here. This is then in the book that I was told before this talk I should do some commercials on that Alberto was also mentioned. But I would recall from this history the fact that in his variations on cogito, Lacan made a great deal of Descartes' therefore, proposing ever new interpretations and transcriptions of Descartes' inference, which all target the inscription and constitution of the subject on two heterogeneous but nevertheless mutually linked places and registers: enunciation, enunciated, thought, being, consciousness, unconscious, truth, knowledge, etc. Hence, the idea of the split which traverses thought and sustains its subject constituting its existence on a line that both associates and divides, making the subject in the same move identical and non-identical to itself. Descartes missed the opportunity to philosophically grasp the split in question. That's also one of Lacan's points. Alienation was encountered and overlooked as soon as he accomplished the move from methodological doubt to scientific certainty, and from cogito, understood as enunciation without substance and thought without qualities, to res cogitans, conceived as immaterial substance and thought with qualities, above all with the quality of consciousness. And subsequent philosophies forgot, if I may say so, the encounter with alienation as the birth hour of the first modern theory of the subject, and privileged the examination of the laws of conscious thought. The main feature of the subject, its constitutive instability and its futile, metonymic, historical, and thus alienated character were removed from the picture. To return again at this point to Descartes' founding gesture, despite all its tendency to stabilize thought and subjectivity, the Cartesian example succeeded in demonstrating that cogito is no metaphysical substance, but a specific action which depends entirely on the signifier, a signifier in action, whose ontological consequences remain ambiguous. Cogito is caught in an ontological gray zone between not yet being and no longer non-being. Descartes' idealistic decision with respect to those consequences led to the familiar substantialization of thought and the abolition of continuous discontinuity, or discontinuous continuity, however we want to have it, between the inside and the outside. Their subsequent materialist determination conditioned a threefold decentralization of thinking, of language, and of history. Let's say here again, Hegel, Marx, and Freud, instead of Nietzsche. So Marx and Freud are hyper-Cartesians in the sense that they overcome the normalization of Descartes' founding gesture by radicalizing its groundbreaking point of departure and inversing the idealist stabilization of the cogito, which transformed its metonymic being into the metaphor of the thinking substance, and thereby regressed into the framework of what I would professorically call metaphorical ontology, obsessed with the question of the highest being. The main critical gesture of Marx and Freud resides in the move from who to where, from the thinking and laboring substance to the place of thought and labor. At the center of this critical endeavor is once again the desubstantialization of thought, a related yet more radical attempt at the Cartesian reduction of all thought procedures to the apparently empty I think, withdrawn from the noise of the world. The Cartesian move, radical as it may seem, nevertheless failed to remove one crucial quality of thought, which was in turn destabilized by skepticism, consciousness, of which Descartes made the anchoring point of the subject's certitude. I have here a passage where Lacan comments on skepticism that I will skip so I can get at least to part of the point that I want to make. But the point of this quote is that Descartes' method merely imitates skepticism. And this is confirmed from the viewpoint of the results provided by what Descartes calls provisory morality and the meditation on cogito in his meditations. So the Cartesian doubt is undoubtedly anchored in what Lacan calls aphanesis, fading, in which we can observe the emergence of a subject whose being is reduced to fading, neither present nor absent, caught in the gray zone of existence and inexistent, a subject who is no longer non-being and not yet Dasein, existence, being there, but rather is a Fatum Dasein, a being there and away, in reference to Freud's example of his grandchild game. So my being is Fatum Dasein. The subject's being contains a perpetual dynamic which takes the form of exchanging appearance and disappearance. However, Descartes' road to science, paved by his desire for epistemic certainty and ontological stability, seems to sacrifice the crucial aspect of skepticism and thereby of the aphanesis of thinking and being. Not simply the refusal of all knowledge and the regression into some textbook example of sophistic relativism, but rather the insistence on non-relation and the incompatibility of truth and knowledge, on the conflictual character of truth. The impossibility of overcoming the conflictuality of truth by reducing it to accumulated knowledge endowed with certainty, where truth appears in the guise of facticity and relationality. Moreover, if there is something heroic in the position of skepticism, as Lacan puts it in the quote that I didn't quote, it concerns its persistence in the situation in which the subject of thought assumes the impossible position that Lacan describes as separation. Separation does not stand for an abolition or overcoming of alienation, but for its radicalization, which reveals precisely the inexistence of the other. For instance, the inexistence of Descartes' benevolent and truth-loving God, and exposes the groundlessness of the subject's thinking and being. The skeptic recognizes in the subject's fading, instability, incompleteness, uncertainty, the constitutive feature of subjectivity, which at the same time exposes the incompleteness of the other. And for this precise reason, as I stated initially, Lacan correlates the barred subject with the barred other. In this respect, radical skepticism points in a direction that seems to lead away from Descartes. In the skeptic's separation from every phantasmatic ground projected in the other, the fading of the subject intensifies to the extent that it becomes the sign of inexistence, negativity, and incompleteness of the other, not of the subject, of the other. The skeptic cogito would thus infer, I doubt, therefore I fade, and moreover, I doubt, therefore the other does not exist, thereby exposing the continuum between alienation of the subject and alienation of the other. In Descartes, on the contrary, the fading of the subject is seemingly overcome by an attempt to demonstrate the nexus of the ontological existence of the subject and the epistemological certitude of knowledge, which are in turn taken as signs of the other's existence. I'm imperfect, so this must be a sign of a perfect being, which is a little bit difficult, hard to buy. On the other way around, Descartes' foundation of the subject on certainty, the certainty of knowledge, and the stable relation between knowledge and truth are possible only under the assumption of a benevolent other, a truth-loving God who does not play tricks on us. And it is no coincidence that Lacan described this Cartesian God with the term the subject supposed to know, a meta-subject. The subject of knowledge desired by the alienated subject of doubt, concretely Descartes himself. So I think this is going way too late, so I'll just skip to the last page, so we get to an end. Sorry about this. Psychoanalysis may not have succeeded in reinventing pre-modern skepticism, or this heroic, radicalized skepticism that Lacan opposes or contrasts to Descartes, but it did propose a double affirmation of the skeptic anchoring of thought in what Lacan calls the living moment of the aphanesis of the subject, and of the Cartesian rupture with the pre-modern theory of the subject, the Aristotelian metaphysical soul. For its way of proceeding is from I think to I desire. In Descartes' case, I desire to be, or I desire to know. Lacan also remarks in this unquoted passage, desidero is the Freudian cogito, so desiring is the Freudian desire is the Freudian thought. Another possible psychoanalytic formulation of the cogito would thus be, I desire, therefore I fade, thus proposing an inversion of Descartes' ontological thesis. Desidero exposes the metonymy of the subject's being, rather than its fixity and stability. The subject of desire cannot but remain caught in the movement of presence and absence, lack and surplus, which as said cannot be mapped onto each other and stabilized. This is also the critical point of Freud's imperative, wo es war, soll ich werden, where it was there I shall become. So the subject never really is. It remains torn between a being that was and a being that will be, between no longer being and not yet being. The Freudian subject is a process of becoming from which the restlessness of the negative is impossible to eliminate. Only once it is deduced as a subject of certitude, the Cartesian cogito is anchored in an apparently ahistorical present, while the Freudian desidero, and one could also say the Marxian lavoro, working, remains split between past and future, which come together in a conflicted labor in the present. And the centrality of labor in Freud's theory of the unconscious leaves no doubt that the unconscious cogito is internally redoubled on desidero and lavoro. The problematic of labor enters the picture in its double guise, as the ongoing labor of the unconscious which sustains the established psychopathological complex that consumes the subject, so that would be the part of wo es war, and the labor of analysis which strives to bring about a future change in the analysant, precisely by working on his or her history and the stretching of its consequences into the present. That would be the soll ich werden part. Changing the past is the main condition for inventing the future. And this, I think, would be also the point where I would situate the encounter of Marxism and psychoanalysis and material implication, where truth follows from truth, and not false from false, or not false, I mean true from false, whatever. So thanks. Sorry, I was a little bit too long. Interpellation.
Okay, there's a couple of okay, so I think I'll maybe start by assuming my function as chair, host, moderator, and so on, and maybe pose a couple of questions to bring your papers together, and actually just to, in a sense, to reframe the original abstract for the session in light of what you've said. And I guess there are questions regarding what exactly does happen to contemporary debates, but let's say contemporary debates in that long post-68 wave about the relationship between psychoanalysis and Marxism, or psychoanalysis and capitalism as an object of Marxist theory, when we think of them in light of the Soviet difference, for want of a better term. And I suppose the first question, which is perhaps more a question for Keti, is about whether these are problems that could be usefully approached by returning to a category, I guess, is central not so much to the Marxist theory of capitalism, but to the Marxist theory of communism. This is also a way of maybe getting you to elucidate more, which I found very interesting, but I didn't quite get my head around the socialism-communism distinction. But the question is, in a sense, whether there isn't, to put it perhaps somewhat facetiously, like a psychic or psychoanalytic equivalent of something like the new economic policy, so to speak. So you have a situation in which basically in order to reproduce itself as a revolutionary process, Soviet Union, in the early 20s finds it necessary to
Capitalist.
inoculate itself or with a without market. After one has abandoned, whether fully or partially or temporarily, the idea of war communism as the possibility of a kind of more positively catastrophic, etc. transition. And I think it's an interesting issue because you're partly bringing up this issue of different forms of commodity, different forms of the body, and so on and so forth. And there is, at least within the domain of historical studies of the Soviet Union, for instance, the whole study of I'm thinking of a very interesting book by Christina Kier called Imagine No Possessions, for
I know
instance.
this book on Rodchenko.
Yeah, so this whole question, what happens when, the object is no longer a commodity in the capitalist sense, even though there are kind of quasi-markets, but the object is rethought by Rodchenko, Mayakovsky, the object as comrade, a different relation to the object. And so in that sense, it seems that I wonder whether one could think in a more psychoanalytically informed vein about this.
About communism.
Well, about the issue of transition, about what does it mean, rather than thinking in this perhaps too easily dichotomous way about, okay, well, here's psychoanalysis in capitalism, what happens with psychoanalysis in non-capitalism or in socialism, etc. Perhaps a more interesting question, which is of course also the question of, Lenin's debates with Clara Zetkin about, the place of debates about sexuality and gender, etc., and the revolution, etc. So, in this weird Otto interview about communism, Althusser has this formulation about transition when he says, the formal subsumption of capitalism under communism. And I was wondering, I guess, if there is a psychoanalytic version of that. And I suppose my question, which is linked and perhaps more to Samo, would be to, I guess if one frames debates about psychoanalysis and ideology in light of what the material that Keti presented, and also these texts by Voloshinov and Vygotsky and others, it does seem that then, I suppose one could argue that there are theories, Marxist theories of ideology, that would perhaps be transposed into a Soviet or indeed state socialist or a distributed economy scenario in a way that doesn't seem to trouble them too much, and ones that aren't. And that seems an issue that has to do with the question of fetishism in particular. So, in many ways it seems to me that you can take at least certain variants of Althusser's theory of ideology and transpose them to non-capitalist contexts in a not particularly difficult way, in part because the question of fetishism is either denied or extremely marginal to that phenomenon. On the other hand, I'm not sure that in the different relationships to body, commodity, etc. that you were talking about, at least certainly in the 20s, would make a critical theoretical or a Frankfurt School or a theory, fetish theory of ideology operative in the same manner. And I guess that then also goes to the issue of alienation, in the sense that what are the points, given your account, what are the points within a Lacanian problematization of the theory of alienation that require further theorizing a logic of capital, or are there points where, in a sense, the logic of fantasy and the logic of capital come apart, and would something like thinking through those Soviet transformations and experiences be like a kind of test, in the sense of, it's not to say, well, this is an ahistorical theory of alienation, but perhaps it's a theory of alienation whose historicity does not force it to be operative in a capitalist context and not be operative in a Soviet one. I don't know if that makes sense. But those were just maybe some ways of posing the question. And maybe you can come back to that, and then we can take some more.
If I remember correctly, the question was how to use or how to address non-capitalist socioeconomic frameworks with alienation. Is that?
Yeah, in some sense. I mean.
Yeah. No, I mean it's in a way it's.
I mean, in the sense of, what happens, for instance, to statements like the proletariat is the subject of the unconscious when class struggle is declared, or that kind of.
Yeah. No, but I mean it's also very clear that because they do not start from the assumption of an ahistorical subjectivity, Marx and Freud cannot but stick to what is in the given predicament, a historical form of subjectivity and a historical form of alienation. That's why, of course, this homologization that Lacan indicates between the subject of the unconscious and the proletarian, and more extensively elaborates between surplus enjoyment and surplus value, is valid for the epoch of modernity, or for capitalism. Of course, it doesn't have any sense outside, but the link between alienation and production of subjectivity on the one hand, and the link between the symbolic order and production of surplus is, I think, something that touches upon a limit, not a limit between historical and ahistorical, but between two historical frameworks, and that there is a metamorphosis taking place. So the metamorphosis of the surplus object and the metamorphosis of alienated subjectivity in a historical predicament, or in the transition from one historical predicament into the other. I think one can demonstrate this in Marx's chapter on primitive accumulation, where the question is precisely the historical genesis of the capitalist alienated subjectivity and the capitalist version of the surplus object. So the generation of a symbolic order in which we talk about the proletarian and surplus value as the products of this historically determined symbolic order. So I think alienation in itself is an empty concept. Because an empty concept, because it needs historical framing. It's not like Homo economicus, the assumption of a transhistoric human essence. One cannot say Homo economicus is the subject of the unconscious, or Homo economicus is the proletariat. It doesn't make sense because it doesn't relate to a something. It's assumed as a transhistoric human essence, greed would be the defining feature here.
E or
Greed,
I?
greed, or what Marx calls drive of enrichment.
Mm-hmm. Chromatistics, as it were.
Chromatistics. As if it's the same issue in chromatistics and in capitalist economies. It's not. It's not. But the point that the ahistorical, if you want, point, or the historical point that connects different historical regimes and symbolic orders that Lacan does make is, and I think this is a Marxist, or at least compatible with Marxism, would be that there is no symbolic order without production of a problematic surplus. That's also his point that there is no language that would be merely communicating. Just one sentence. They're not like you have, for instance, this kind of reading. that in communist or in socialist, real socialism, you have an excess of fetishization of persons in order to kind of
what do you mean fetishization? Fetishization of persons? What is
fetishization of persons instead of fetishization of economy, of commodities, or like economic abstractions that kind of supplemented the fetishism of economic abstractions. So Zizek makes this point in Sublime Object of Ideology. That, this is where you can pinpoint, cult of personality, father of the nation, all this bullshit, is ultimately a demonstration of I wouldn't say fetishist afterlives.
Yes, I understand.
But a different fetishism that also exists in capitalism.
May I add to this? Well, this is again the point. Like it had fetishism, it had surplus, language surplus. Yes, but I would like to make one point. Well, first of all, you very beautifully described this split between thinking and being when you were talking about capital and how it is becoming signification. And I think that this split exactly into things and into speculation was the main trauma for the post-communist condition. Simply because, of course, only idiot can claim that alienation can be redeemed. We are born and we are alienated already by birth. So all those traumatic things, they are part and parcel of it. But the question is what do you do with this term of alienation? How you deal with it, right? So if you take the ontognoseology that takes place after revolution, and my point was that exactly due to this ontognoseology of, let's connect thinking and being, let's connect the sign, the use value and the thing. So exactly to this illusion maybe, but in a certain sense, excessive hope that this is happening, there was this total new philosophic ontognoseology which was constructing out of Marx some kind of new material idealist Marxist metaphysics in a way, which is claiming that from now on this exactly Cartesian split into speculation and extension can be somehow transformed, and you can use here Hegel, Marx, Spinoza. So these are the tools to make this montage and bring about a new condition.
See, that's why this Spinoza part.
This Spinoza part.
Why?
But then again, Zizek's point about inevitable alienation is true, definitely, because, socialist, Zizek is always picking out all those deviations of socialism and claiming, look, ideology, liberalism is ideology, but communist ideology is total perversion. Yes, that's true, but perversion is shadow. This is very important because you have this dvayemilia, two worldliness, two worlds, double worldliness. So in one world, you have functioning of all parameters. In the shadow world, which is absolutely kind of inexistent and criminal. So you have all those things functioning in criminal world. But this criminal world is again as I said, the hell that topologically doesn't exist. So what exists is only the effectuated construction, and all those shadow things are kind of not quite the world.
Please, Ben. Sorry, my quick question was going to be, what does a communist psyche or a communist subject look like? And that's not true. Partly of what you're just saying, just one thing, is imagining the division of labour. I'm not sure I would call myself a communist, but imagining the division of labour is the condition being a communist. So you know, that's communism. Abolishing the one, you know, abolishing the family, abolishing the division of labour. So if we can't imagine that, then we're not doing communism, so we're not Marxists, so we debate the relationship between Marxism and communism, so none of these questions would arise. I mean, that's sort of like, that's the problem, I think. You know, it's like, if, going back to alienation, I mean, you're both saying, you know, we're aiming at a system with less alienation or something better, otherwise we're increasing human suffering. So, you know, I don't know, that's the kind of crux of the problem. Psychoanalysis seems to imply, which I agree with, a sort of minimum of human suffering, at the same time as the communist or Marxist thinking seems to imply we can alleviate that suffering. You know, otherwise, you know, why would we be that? Why wouldn't we just be enjoying what we've got? You know, and that's the right-wing Nietzschean peace and critique. You're whining, you know, you're just communists. So just, you know, you're just whining about things. Yeah, you're disadjusted, you're deviant, and you're projecting your own deviancy onto the fact you can't get on in a capitalist system.
No,
so,
if I may just briefly respond. I mean, of course, that's why I'm also saying, you know, like, it appears more rational to me, you know, to go in the direction of, well, we clearly see the problem that also constructions of non-alienated subjectivities have very alienating consequences and can actually anchor, cement relations of exploitation and exhaustion, like, you know, homo economicus. It doesn't function anymore, but, you know, it has been precisely an imperative of de-alienated subjectivity to be forcefully socially implemented with alienating consequences. You know,
mean the socialist is homo economicus?
Just follow the greed, be the good greedy subject that you naturally are anyway. You know, fully actualize your human essence. I'm caricaturizing vulgar neoliberal economics, but, you know, greed is good imperative that, you know, functions only for those on top. But, you know, I mean, that's why I think it's more a question of, yes, short-circuiting, disrupting the fact that we live in a system that is, I mean, yes, it's increasing alienation, because alienation is the ultimate anchoring point of exploitation. It's a nexus of alienation and exploitation that is at stake. And, you know, you don't have to live in capitalism to have this nexus. You can find it elsewhere in history or elsewhere in the present. But what I have a problem with is this, you know, that's why I can't really share the fondness with the Soviet Marxists, this fabrication of fantasies that are fabricated under, I mean, within the horizon determined by capitalism. Whether they're made in the Soviet context or not does not matter. They are fabricated in a historic context when the capitalist imaginary still determines the global frame, the capitalist symbolic order.
I don't understand why. It is not, you don't have the evidences in art and production. Capitalist imaginaries remain to be imaginaries, but they are some kind of on the outskirts and on the marginality of this construction. Well, when you are saying that you have the same alienation, the same exploitation in socialist context, I would not agree, because what I want to say that is alienation is more bearable than non-alienation. I'm not saying that you can have, I mean, that de-alienation is good, but what I'm saying is that socialism is an overdose of non-alienatedness. Maybe it also contains forms of alienation, but it has the dose and overdose of non-alienation, which has not been bearable. So the question is how to alienate more, how to have more alienation, then to bear this non-alienated.
Just as a point of clarification. Because
the superstructure is working artificially as non-alienated.
But that's
So
that-
can we-
yeah.
Because I think the clarification that someone has to say, in whatever you want to call it, historical communism, actually existing socialism, or whatever, the terminology is not particularly relevant, but I just want you maybe to pinpoint, what do you mean by, because of course we can work with very different definitions of alienation. Psychic definitions, economic ones, and so on and so forth. Without giving it a positive or negative valence, like ideology. So when you say that there is an excess of non-alienation in a socialist context, what kind of social relations or phenomena are you referring to that would be non-alienated in that sense? Because I can...
Well, for instance, the condition when even the conditions of poverty are not regarded as the conditions of poverty, but they are regarded the conditions of a satisfactory plenitude.
But by whom?
By everyone. So, for instance, if you take one and the same interior...
But this isn't actually like...
Yeah, actually,
in the
yeah.
Soviet Union in the
Yeah.
1960s, people
Yeah.
didn't think they were
Yeah,
poor.
but what... Yes, they didn't think that they were poor.
But
They,
were-
well, they
or they were satisfied.
They were satisfied. That's the point. So
But
when,
what is the... Okay.
so you have this equality in poverty and interiors and textures of poverty, which by capitalist subjects are taken as poverty, as lack. So there is this libidinal desire to improve it, to find new phantasms of just enriching this absolute squalor of being. But what for capitalist subject is a squalor and misery of being, for the subject of the socialist consumer, even if he's finding, oh, I lack this and this and this, he is not invested into this libidinal urge of lacking something within this pleroma of poverty. And this is completely different perspective to understand that poverty is not poverty. But this is
But that's a
poverty
different
for a
issue. Even if one were
capitalist
to
subject.
accept that, that's a different issue. That would be a different issue than alienation.
Yes, no, it's not a different issue of alienation, because what is this poverty about? This poverty is about a distributive construction of economy, which is artificially equalizing all the consumers.
But we know it isn't. I mean, Soviet Union was a very stratified society
Well,
politically stratified, which is a very different... I mean, I think this is the interesting issue.
Stratified,
because
but look, what is the stratification? It's the basic need remuneration. Totally basic need and remuneration, and the difference between stratification is like 2 or 3 times, not 100 times, as you have in capitalism. So, I mean, I lost my thread, but
this is, I wanted to get into the difference between the quantitative arguments and the qualitative arguments. So you can, this is what I meant
quantity and quality are interconnected.
by definitions of alienation. So if you have a society in which social difference and social power is politically allocated, which is the case in, I think, all actually existing socialist societies, it's a political alienation of power and a differential allocation of goods, bluntly put, who gets the dasha or the holidays, who does not, who's a good worker, who does not, who
No, this
controls...
is shadow economy.
But that political alienation, that political allocation, you could say, by a certain definition of alienation, you could say feudal society is not alienated because I know why I'm a serf, and I know why he's a lord, and I know I will always be a serf. And it's not alienated in the sense that there is no mystification about this relation other than, let's say, it's imposed by God, but usually it's just a kind of realism. But in that sense, we're talking about something that's not alienation, but it's not a positive definition of something that's not alienation. I guess,
May I
if that
say
makes-
something?
yeah.
When Marx is describing the commodity, he's saying that the commodity has this verwandelt construction, so it is existing due to radical alienation of labor, of production, of existence, but it seems to be cozy. So capitalist production sustains exactly because being alienated, it produces non-alienated images of beauty, of comfort. Here you have the other way around.
Right.
You have so what I'm saying, the common good, the non-alienation is bringing the conditions which look alienated for the capitalist subject.
Though I wouldn't want to enter,
Nevertheless, they are, that's why I say non-alienation is hardly and in a difficult way non-bearable, because it brings the outcomes and perspectives and images which are much more looking like an alienation, but in their core they are due to de-alienating moduses. So what happens when we persevere in this de-alienation? We come to the uncanny constructions which for capitalist subject are the images of terrible misery.
Sorry, there was one back there first, then, sorry.
I just want to make a comment about the unconscious and socialist realism, which was the kind of literature of the really existing socialism. And it seems to me that there is a, how shall I start this? About the socialist economy and the persistence of whatever you want to call it, the shadow economy or the capitalist elements within the really existing socialism. And it seems to me that in social, basically, I'll start this because it's quite succinct, but Andrzej Danov, in his infamous manifesto for the socialist realism, he said that under the new system, all exploitative economic relations have been eliminated, and therefore that there is a new subject, which is the new man in the English translation that I read, and that the only struggles that they are to be exist in the new society is the construction of socialism on one side, so it's the struggle of man versus nature, and the other one is the struggle against what he refers to the remnants of the petit bourgeois mentality. So there is this famous phrase where he says that the consciousness of the people lags behind the transformation in the material basis. But the problem is that, so this was in 1932, 1934, in the early 30s when this was come up. But if one reads the literature up to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the struggle against petty bourgeois mentality persists. It's a continuous element. So it has never been overcome. Now, this is what I see that exactly where the psychoanalysis, a psychoanalytical interpretation will help, because it shows that this is the return of the repressed, this petty bourgeois mentality. Now, the repression of the system, on the one hand, created this kind of new subject, let's say, although even their alienation was deeply rooted in the creation of this, like for example, there is this novel, How the Steel Was Tempered,
yes,
with Korchagin, I think is the name of the Ostrovsky, yes. And basically there what happened is that the new subject, which is Korchagin, basically it's completely alienated from his own body. He's taken over by his communist mentality, and by the end of the novel his body, because he basically destroys his body in his dedication to the cause of the revolution. So he sacrifices, you could say, that body for, but the thing is that his subjectivity becomes more and more fierce. So that's the metaphor of how the steel was turned of the. So basically, the alienation there, it's real. Between the superstructure and the base, in a sense. Let me finish. So, what I think it happened is that the question of socialist realism, to interpret that,
remains how to, whatever we, how to say, posit the ontology of the repressed, wherever there is this old idea that sexuality and a fully constituted subject is repressed, or a more constructivist one, that the actual discourses of power construct the subject of the repressed. The persistence of the petty bourgeois subjectivity that it constantly has to be struggled against, it looks like it's a product of the socialist discourse of power. So it seems to me that the alienation was embedded within the discourse of socialist realism.
Good observation, but I think definitely, well, first of all, I wouldn't agree that in Korchagin his idea is alienation from the body. On the contrary, it's a little bit, well, it's not the classical stupid socialist realist novel. So it is a specific piece, and I would rather compare it to Platonov's literature, which is not this hardcore, formalized and Stalinist, stupid socialist realism. Therefore, I would say that here, as I noted before, the question is not of alienating idea from the body, but rather this other determined non-self. It's the non-self issue. It's this situation that when you deal with the situation that the split between well, the dialectics of every identity is not nominal, but it has to be constantly posited as the other self, and in the dialectics of the othering, and this is part and parcel of all philosophic and psychological issues, then you understand why everything is first and foremost the idea. So this is what I wanted to say. The idea is not alienated, but he decomposes himself because the body is the idea, and the idea is body. This is what I wanted to tell. That in this construction, idea is invading body to the extent that what exists and what decomposes is hard to delimit. This is the first thing, and this happens in Platonov as well. Platonov's hero John, for instance, he is also absolutely, there is no limit of how to protect the body, because there is this self-obsessive idea of bringing the whole group to a certain goal. But another thing about the petty bourgeois which is seeping through, I think this petty bourgeois condition was created by Stalinist stratification of intelligentsia, of actors, etc., which again, as I say, and for instance, Vladimir Sorokin shows it very well. It is not the deviation of the system, of the common good of communism. Stalin is himself, as power, the deviation from the system. So it's not that the system didn't work and it contained these ideas of alienation and deviation, but the agents of the system could not deal with the construction of common good, and therefore, if you look, the decomposition of the socialist comes from above.
My question, Samo, you answered my question to a certain degree, you moved in that direction, but then in the discussions, what was brought up was this tension between a structural and a historical conception of alienation, that it sort of led me back to my question, that I felt that it's still not very clear to me. That when it comes to the subject in psychoanalysis, sexuality, knowledge or language, are structured around the fundamental negativity or crack, which unites them at the point of the unconscious. So that is how they get united around the unconscious, these three elements. This psychoanalytic account sort of converges with, accounts we get in Western philosophy or in philosophical anthropology. Like one example, there are examples, but one example would be Agamben's Language and Death, where he sort of develops a relation between the subject or language and negativity in a philosophical manner without any recourse to psychoanalysis, as you know. So on the one hand, we have this conception of the subject that is general and universal and trans-historical, as you said, And even in Aristotle, even though I completely agree with what you said about Aristotle, but even in Aristotle, the difference between primary qualities and secondary qualities is very much what in modern linguistics is considered as a difference between indication and demonstration or signification, that where language announces itself as an event and then the moment of meaning, which there is a gap between these two moments where you have language simply as an event and then the moment of demonstration or signification, or in Lacan like langue and parole, or so primary qualities, table, tree, and this table, this tree, when you use shifters, and shifters in a Hegelian way bring in the element of temporality, and therefore that's where the subjects basically plays a role. So you see this idea of originary negativity or crack in language is very old, even in a way it goes back to Aristotle. So on the one hand, we get this in psychoanalysis, which is very much compatible with this account. But on the other hand, as that was the subject of your talk, and even you connected, the theorization of alienation to the Cartesian cogito, and then we see that for Lacan, the subject of the unconscious is the Cartesian subject. So the importance of unconscious still seems very historical and modern to me, and it's not very clear to me how these two moments are reconciled, that modern Cartesian historical moment and the metaphysical moment that runs through the history of Western philosophy.
Well, I mean, they are not reconciled even in the present. It's in a way, that's also the point that I like about Jean-Jacques Lecerf's book on philosophy, or research on philosophy of language, where he basically shows that there is something like a persistence. I mean, that in a way we're all Aristotelians in the sense that that we relate to language in a tool-like manner and communicational model. And Lacan is not saying that this is not happening in language. You mentioned langage and parole. They only exist in fusion. They only exist in la langue, written together. You cannot have pure speech that would be detached from the body. You cannot have pure language that would be completely functional. So Lacan introduces this focus on the in-betweenness between these two poles. Ultimately, it's only the mix, and it only contains the tension within it. In a way, we're talking about dualism and monism, and it is a conflicted monism. It's not a dualism. Lacan is not a dualist. And I mean, I'm aware, of course, that in Aristotle, before you enter metaphysics, you have to invent the ideal language, which functions, which is capable of describing stable being. And again, I'm not saying that this does not exist, but Lacan, or Freud and Lacan in particular, inverts the perspective and posits the point from which the gaze on language is thrown to the problematic of instability, or from the problematic of instability. And it doesn't mean that structure and history fall apart, because you said at the beginning something that made me think as if, I assume the position where these two poles are opposite. For Lacan, they're not. For Lacan, you cannot detach structure from its historical transformations, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to talk about clinics.
One final question.
I
Sorry, I didn't mean to load your question with a finality.
The weight of
It
the
was
final
just,
question.
It has to be one after mine.
know.
Thank you both for brilliant papers, and I'm just going to touch on a few things. I want to just take up this question of the optic difference, this different kind of geometry and choreography, and the kind of suffering that's an effect of it. And just to say that, I don't know if I fully understood all the incredible moves that you made, but it seems to me it's quite close to what Lacan maps in an ethics of desire, that an ethics of desire is dependent on alienation, and that, the economy and service of goods literally plugs up the topological space, which is the place of death, which is the lacunar being, which is the feminine, the not all, in other words. And in the ethics, when he's mapping how not to give ground on desire, Lacan places Marx as quite conservative. He places him in the field of the logic of the economy and service of goods, and says because Marx plugs that topological place, which is necessary for desire, which is the not all. He switches it up by thinking that everything can be faced by distributing goods in an equal way across the surface of the earth. So he returns it to the economy and service of goods. And so you never get to face desire, because you have to undeceive that as an ethics of desire. And I sort of feel that's what's at stake in what you unpack today, and the kind of suffering. When you're actually deprived of desire because everything is being sutured up in terms of a notion of the common good and an equal distribution of goods, and you remain in the sutured up space. So that's just a response to you, and a response
It's
to...
a great comment, it's not a question, it's a wonderful comment, and thank you for this reference.
Thank you. And then just one other in relation to Alberto's question to you. He asked, what would it be to sort of cleave, if I understood it correctly, what would it be to open up fantasy and capitalism? And I thought it would have to be the act. It would have to be what's at stake in the act, which takes you from the bad infinite to the transitive infinite of the not all. It would have to be that kind of ethical act, which is the destruction, creation, ex nihilo kind of moment. That's what I think as a response to Alberto's question. I don't know if you agree with that.
I think we should leave it with this remark, because yes, I mean, of course,
it was a
agree with what
fantastic
you were saying.
compliment. Fantastic comment, because I think it's incredible that you gave me this reference.
And also brought in the reference to Lacan's theory of action.
And the act,
which
is a non-derisory crossing of the limit, which is non-pacificatory and changes all the coordinates and the topology of what is, whether that be at the level of revolution or in the subject.
Well, I'm sorry, if I may, I would add something to this. I think Lacan's theory of the act, nevertheless, I would think it in pair with the question of Durcharbeiten, of working through in Freud. The act has transformative consequences only insofar as it triggers and sustains a labor.
Yes.
And labor is for Freud and for Marx and for, well, others, something that defines whether a social link is exploitative or non-exploitative.
So that you would be fidelity.
Well, for Badiou, yeah, the process of truth was, I think, Dominic Kuhns and Ed Plut were comparing it with the truth procedure with working through. Yeah.
Okay, well on that note, join me in thanking our speakers.